Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the flour, dusted hell of Victorian England, where baking bread wasn't a quaint profession, but a slow-motion death sentence wrapped in 18-hour shifts. So before we descend into the bakehouse, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you're into historically accurate suffering. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and whether you've ever worked a job that made you question your life choices. Now, grab something to drink, get comfortable, and let's journey back to a time when making your daily bread literally meant breathing poison until your lungs gave out. This is the story of Thomas Whitworth and what it was really like to be a Victorian baker. Welcome to Victorian England, where bread was both the staff of life and the product of what can only be described as institutionalized sleep deprivation mixed with casual poisoning. Meet Thomas Whitworth, a journeyman baker in 1850s London, who began his workday at the unholy hour of 11 o'clock at night and didn't see his bed again until tea time the following afternoon. His wife barely recognized him. His children thought he was a mythical creature, and his lungs were slowly turning into flour, coated sponges that would eventually kill him before he reached 50. But let's back up, because understanding what it meant to be a baker in Victorian England requires understanding that this wasn't just a job. It was a descent into a white, dusted hell where economics, chemistry, class warfare, and municipal corruption all converged in a basement that reached temperatures hot enough to bake a man alongside his bread. Thomas wasn't living the dream. He was living the chronic exhaustion punctuated by moments of scalding terror and the occasional satisfaction of producing something people actually needed to survive. The Victorian bakery wasn't the charming establishment you're picturing with doilies and a kindly old woman behind the counter. Most bakeries were underground or semi-underground establishments called bakehouses, and calling them dungeons wouldn't be far off. These were cramped, poorly ventilated spaces where the air was thick enough to chew. Flour dust hung in the atmosphere like a permanent fog, getting into eyes, noses, lungs, and every conceivable crevice of the human body. The ovens radiated heat that turned these subterranean spaces into approximations of the seventh circle of hell, especially in summer when temperatures inside could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Thomas would arrive at his bakehouse just before midnight, already exhausted from whatever minimal sleep he'd managed during the day. Sleep was the first casualty of bakery life. The baking schedule was determined not by human circadian rhythms, but by the simple fact that bread needed to be fresh for the morning. Rich people expected their bread warm for breakfast. Poor people needed their bread cheap and ready before they shuffled off to their own 12-hour factory shifts. This meant the baking had to happen in the dark hours, which meant bakers existed in a permanent state of temporal confusion, their bodies never quite sure whether it was time to sleep or work. The first task was firing up the ovens, and this was where the job immediately became dangerous. Victorian brick ovens were heated by wood or coal fires, built directly inside the baking chamber. The baker had to get these fires roaring hot, then rake out all the coals and ashes, and quickly mop out the interior before the temperature dropped too much. One wrong move, one stumble, and you were falling face first into a space that could melt lead. Burns were so common among bakers that scarred forearms were essentially the uniform. Thomas bore the marks of at least a dozen serious burns, including one spectacular incident involving a collapsed flue that had sent him to a charity hospital for 3 weeks and cost him a month's wages he couldn't afford to lose. While the ovens heated, Thomas would begin the mixing. This was before industrial mixers, before electric anything, before any kind of mechanical assistance worth mentioning. Duff was mixed by hand in massive wooden troughs. And when I say mixed by hand, I mean the baker would climb into the trough, often barefoot, and literally knead the dough with his feet, his hands, his entire body weight. A single batch might contain 150 pounds of flour mixed with water, salt, and yeast, and getting it to proper consistency required the kind of full, body workout that would make a modern gym enthusiast weep. The dough was heavy, resistant, and absolutely unforgiving. Bakers developed arms and shoulders like dock workers, but they also developed back problems, knee problems, and repetitive strain injuries that would plague them for life. Thomas's hands were so deformed from decades of kneading that he could barely make a fist anymore. His fingers were permanently curved, the joints swollen and aching, especially in cold weather. He couldn't write legibly, couldn't handle small objects without dropping them, and had long since given up on any hobby that required manual dexterity. His hands were tools, and tools didn't need to be pretty. But here's where Victorian baking gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean horrifying. Because Thomas, like virtually every other baker in England, wasn't just making bread. He was making bread plus a fascinating array of adulterants. Because pure bread made from pure flour was expensive, and the working class couldn't afford expensive. They could only afford cheap, and cheap meant adding things to the flour that definitely weren't supposed to be in bread. The most common adulterant was alum, a type of aluminum sulfate that made bread whiter, lighter, and apparently more desirable to customers who had been conditioned to believe that white bread was superior to brown. Never mind that alum was mildly poisonous. Never mind that it caused digestive problems and could lead to more serious health issues with prolonged consumption. It made the bread look good. It masked the greyish colour of cheap flour, and it helped bakers stretch their more expensive ingredients further. Thomas didn't particularly like adding alum to his dough, but his master baker insisted on it. And when you're a journeyman, you do what you're told or you find yourself without employment. But alum was just the beginning. Victorian flour was routinely cut with chalk, plaster of Paris sawdust, and even ground bones. Bone meal was particularly popular because it added bulk and a certain amount of mineral content that could almost be mistaken for nutritional value. Almost. Some bakers added potato starch, bean flour, or rice flour, which were at least edible. Others added pipe clay, which decidedly wasn't. The worst offenders, the real bottom feeders of the baking trade, would add anything white and powdery they could get their hands on, including limestone and ground-up bricks. The rationale was simple economics. A sack of pure wheat flour cost money. A sack of flour cut with 20% chalk cost less money. Bakers operated on razor-thin margins, especially those catering to the poor. They were competing against dozens of other bakeries in any given neighborhood, all trying to offer the cheapest loaf. If you didn't adulterate, your competitor would, and their bread would be cheaper than yours, and you'd lose customers, and you'd go bankrupt. It was a race to the bottom, and the bottom was literally made of ground bones and industrial waste. Thomas tried to rationalize it. Everyone did it. The customers didn't know. And honestly, a little chalk probably wasn't going to kill anyone, at least not quickly. But he knew it was wrong. He knew that the children who ate this bread, the pregnant women, the elderly people barely surviving on bread and tea, they deserved better. They deserved real food. But real food cost real money, and nobody in the slums of Victorian London had real money. They had pennies, and pennies bought adulterated bread, or no bread at all. The yeast situation was its own adventure in microbiology gone wrong. Good bread requires good yeast, but good yeast cost money and required careful maintenance. Most bakers used whatever yeast they could get, often recycled from the local brewery. Brewer's yeast was cheap and abundant, but it was also inconsistent, sometimes contaminated, and occasionally just dead. Thomas had seen batches fail because the yeast was bad, resulting in dents. Heavy loaves that customers complained about and wouldn't buy. A failed batch meant wasted ingredients, wasted time, wasted fuel, and potentially wasted jobs if it happened too often. Some bakers maintained their own yeast cultures, carefully feeding them with flour and water, keeping them alive week after week. This required skill and attention. Thomas had attempted it once, but his yeast culture had become infected with something. He never figured out what. That made the bread taste sour and slightly rotten. He'd thrown the whole culture out and gone back to buying brewery yeast, accepting the inconsistency as the price of not having to play nursemaid to a bucket of fermenting goop. Once the dough was mixed and the yeast had been added, Thomas had to let it rise. This was the one part of the process where he wasn't actively doing something, but he couldn't leave because he had to monitor the dough, knead it again when it had risen sufficiently, portion it out into loaf-sized pieces, and shape each loaf by hand. Shaping was an art. A well-shaped loaf rose evenly and baked uniformly. A poorly shaped loaf ended up lopsided, with air pockets in weird places, and would be harder to sell. Thomas could shape a loaf in his sleep, which was fortunate because he was often practically asleep while doing it. The repetitive motion, the warm atmosphere, the late hour, they all conspired to make him drowsy. He'd learned to shape loaves while standing up, even while pacing. Anything to keep his body moving and his brain marginally functional. More than once he'd caught himself starting to doze off with his hands, still mechanically working the dough, his mind drifting into strange dreams about flour turning into snow and ovens turning into dragons. By 3 or 4 in the morning, the first loaves would be ready for the oven. This was where skill really mattered. The oven had to be at exactly the right temperature. Too hot and the outside would burn before the inside cooked. Too cool and the bread would be dense and heavy. There were no thermometers, no temperature gauges, just experience and intuition. Thomas would thrust his hand into the oven, hold it there for a few seconds, and judge the heat by how quickly it became unbearable. It was barbaric and it worked. Loading the oven required a long wooden peel, essentially a giant spatula that the baker used to slide loaves onto the hot brick floor. This was a skill that took years to develop. The peel had to be flicked just right to deposit the loaf precisely where you wanted it without flipping it over or smushing it against the back of the oven. Thomas could load 30 loaves in 5 minutes, each one perfectly positioned, but he'd spent his first year as an apprentice fumbling with the peel, dropping loaves, burning himself, and generally making a hash of the whole operation. The baking process took anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour, depending on the size of the loaves and the type of bread. During this time, Thomas couldn't rest because there were more batches to mix, more dough to shape, more loaves to prepare. The work was relentless. It was a carefully choreographed dance of mixing, rising, shaping, baking, and cooling, with multiple batches at different stages of production at any given time. One moment of inattention, one forgotten batch, and suddenly you had burned bread, wasted ingredients, and an angry master baker screaming at you. The master baker, in Thomas's case a man named Josiah Crumb, which was either nominative determinism at its finest or a cruel joke by his parents, was a tyrant of the flour-dusted realm. Josiah had started as an apprentice himself 40 years earlier, had worked his way up to journeyman, then saved enough to buy his own bakehouse, and now ruled over his small empire with an iron fist and a vocabulary of profanity that could strip paint. He was not a bad man, exactly, but he was a product of a system that ground down everyone involved. And he saw no reason to make life easier for his workers when his own life had been hard. Josiah paid Thomas and the other journeyman the minimum wage he could get away with, which in the 1850s meant about 15 shillings a week for work that consumed roughly 18 hours a day, 6 days a week. Sunday was theoretically a day of rest, though Thomas usually spent it recovering from the week's exhaustion, sleeping, and trying to reconnect with his family before the cycle began again. 15 shillings was barely enough to rent a couple of rooms in a tenement, feed a family, and perhaps have a pint or two on payday. It certainly wasn't enough to save for the future or dream of owning his own bakehouse someday. The apprentices had it worse. The apprenticeship system in Victorian bakeries was essentially legalized child labor. Boys, usually around 13 or 14, would be bound to a master baker for several years. During this time, They worked the same brutal hours as the journeyman, but received only room and board, no wages. They slept in the bakehouse itself, on benches or in corners, breathing flour dust even while they tried to rest. They were the first to arrive and the last to leave. They did all the dirty work, cleaning out ovens, hauling sacks of flour, scrubbing equipment, and generally being worked until they dropped. Thomas had been an apprentice once, 30 years ago, and he remembered it as the worst period of his life. His master had been even crueler than Josiah, a man who believed that apprentices needed to be beaten regularly to instill discipline. Thomas had been hit with wooden spoons, had hot bread thrown at him, had been locked in the bakehouse overnight as punishment for some minor infraction. He'd grown up fast in that environment, learned to keep his head down, work hard, and never, ever complain. When his apprenticeship had finally ended at age 21, he'd sworn he would never treat his own apprentices that way. But he'd never made it to master baker, had never had his own apprentices, so the promise had remained untested. Around 6 in the morning, as dawn broke over London, the shop above the bakehouse would open. Josiah's wife Ethel ran the retail side of the operation. She was a formidable woman who could calculate change, wrap bread, and shame a customer into buying extra buns, all while maintaining a running commentary on the moral failings of the neighborhood. The shop itself was small, just a counter and some shelves, but it was clean and relatively pleasant compared to the inferno below. The bread would come up from the bakehouse still warm, carried on wooden trays by Thomas, or one of the apprentices. There were different varieties, though calling them varieties was generous. There was the standard white loaf, made from flour that was maybe 70% actual wheat and 30% whatever adulterants Josiah had decided were economical that month. There were cheaper brown loaves, made from less refined flour, that actually had more nutritional value, but was considered inferior because it wasn't white. There were rolls, buns, and occasionally fancier items like Sally Lunn cakes or bath buns. Though these were typically made only for special orders from wealthier customers, the poorest customers would come in asking for pieces, which were broken or misshapen bits of bread sold at a discount. Thomas always felt a pang seeing children sent to buy pieces, their small hands clutching a few pennies, knowing that this discounted, adulterated bread was probably the most substantial food they'd eat all day. The children themselves rarely seemed bothered. They were resilient in the way that people who have never known anything better can be resilient. They'd grab their pieces and run off, often eating the bread on the way home, because hunger doesn't wait for proper mealtimes. By mid-morning, Thomas would have been working for nearly 12 hours straight. He was exhausted, covered in flour, sweating despite the fact that the oven heat was finally beginning to dissipate as the morning baking wrapped up. His back ached from the constant bending and lifting. His feet hurt from standing on stone floors. His lungs felt tight from breathing air that was more flour than oxygen. But he couldn't stop yet because there was cleaning to do. Victorian bakehouses were supposed to be cleaned daily, though in practice this meant a quick sweep and maybe mopping up any major spills. The equipment, the troughs, the peels, the counters, they all accumulated layers of dried dough and flour that would eventually become breeding grounds for vermin if not addressed. Rats were a constant problem. They were attracted to the flour, the grain, the warmth, and no amount of traps or poison seemed to fully eliminate them. Thomas had made peace with sharing his workspace with rats. You had to in Victorian London. Fighting the rats was like fighting the fog or the mud. Pointless exercises in futility. The flour itself came from mills that were only marginally more hygienic than the bakehouses. Thomas had visited a flour mill once and immediately wished he hadn't. The grain storage areas were infested with weevils, beetles, and mice. The grinding stones were cleaned irregularly. The whole operation was caked in layers of ancient flour dust that had probably been accumulating since the reign of George III. The flour that emerged from this process was already contaminated before it even reached the bakery, and there was nothing Thomas or any other baker could do about it except use it anyway, because there was no alternative. Sometime around noon or 1 o'clock, Thomas would finally be released to go home. He'd climb up from the bakehouse into actual daylight, blinking like a cave creature seeing the sun for the first time. The contrast was always jarring. While he'd been underground baking bread, the rest of the world had been waking up, going about their business, living in something approaching normalcy. Thomas felt disconnected from all of it, a ghost moving through daylight, too tired to really engage with anything. His home was a 15-minute walk from the bakehouse, which meant he lost a half-hour of potential sleep every day to commuting. The rooms he rented were on the 3rd floor of a building that housed 6 other families. The walls were thin enough that you could hear the neighbors' conversations, arguments, and other activities with crystal clarity. Privacy was a luxury that working-class Victorian families couldn't afford. The rooms themselves were small, damp, and cold in winter despite the small coal fire that his wife tried to keep going. In summer, they were stifling. His wife, Margaret, had learned to adjust her life around his schedule. She'd feed him a meal when he came home, usually something simple, bread, obviously, with butter if they could afford it, maybe some cheese, or a bit of cold meat. Then Thomas would collapse into bed and sleep for 6 or 7 hours if he was lucky, though more often it was 5, because the neighbors were noisy and the children needed attention, and there were always errands to run and problems to solve. Sleep deprivation was chronic and cumulative. Thomas couldn't remember the last time he'd felt truly rested. Margaret herself had tried working for a while, taking in sewing, but the pittance she earned wasn't worth the time away from managing the household and caring for their 3 surviving children. 2 others had died in infancy, one from cholera and one from what was probably pneumonia, though the doctor hadn't been entirely sure, and anyway couldn't do anything about it. Infant mortality was just a fact of Victorian working-class life. You had children and hoped some of them survived. That was the calculation. The children, 2 boys and a girl, ranged in age from 5 to 12. The eldest boy was already talking about apprenticing as a baker, which filled Thomas with a complicated mixture of pride and horror. Pride because his son wanted to follow in his footsteps. Horror because he knew exactly what that life entailed and wished desperately that his son could do better. But better required education, required opportunities, required money they didn't have. The free elementary education that would come with the 1870 Education Act was still decades away. For now, working-class children got whatever education their parents could cobble together, which usually meant a few years of Sunday school where they learned to read the Bible and not much else. Thomas would sleep until early evening, then wake up, groggy and disoriented, for a brief window of family time. This was the only period when he was awake while his children were awake. He'd try to be present, try to be a father, ask about their day, play simple games, read to them if he had the energy. But mostly he was just a tired presence in a chair, drinking weak tea and mentally preparing himself for another night in the bakehouse. His daughter had once asked why Papa was always so tired, and Margaret had tried to explain about Papa's important work making bread for people. But the girl had seemed unconvinced that anything could really require being that tired all the time. Around 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening, Thomas would eat a light meal, usually more bread with maybe some soup or porridge, kiss his wife and any children still awake, and head back out into the London night. The walk back to the bakehouse was always the hardest part. His body knew what was coming, knew that it was about to begin another 18-hour cycle of exhausting labor, and it rebelled. His feet felt like lead. His legs ached before he'd even started. His mind wandered, fantasizing about different lives, different choices, different worlds where he wasn't a baker trapped in a cycle of poverty and exhaustion. But fantasies didn't pay the rent, So Thomas would arrive back at the bakehouse just before 11, hang up his coat, put on his flour-dusted apron, and begin again. Same ovens, same dough, same brutal schedule. Day after day, week after week, year after year, until his body would eventually give out, which it would, because bodies don't survive decades of this kind of abuse without breaking down. The health effects of being a Victorian baker were well documented, at least by reformers and doctors who cared about such things, which didn't include most employers or government officials. Bakers suffered from a specific set of occupational diseases that were so common they were essentially guaranteed. The most obvious was baker's asthma, a chronic respiratory condition caused by constantly breathing flour dust. The fine particles would settle in the lungs, causing inflammation, scarring, and progressive breathing difficulties. Bakers would develop chronic coughs that produced white or grey phlegm. They'd wheeze and struggle to breathe, especially during physical exertion or in cold weather. Thomas had baker's asthma. He'd had it for years. Every morning he'd wake up coughing, his lungs trying to expel the accumulated flour dust from the night before. The coughing fits were exhausting and sometimes led to vomiting. He'd learned to sleep propped up on pillows because lying flat made the breathing worse. Margaret had learned to ignore the sound of his coughing, the way you learn to ignore church bells or street noise, just a part of the background of daily life. The heat exposure caused its own problems. Working in temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit led to chronic dehydration, heat exhaustion, and cardiovascular strain. Bakers had higher rates of heart disease than the general population. They also had higher rates of alcoholism, partly because beer was one of the few ways to rehydrate when clean water was scarce, and partly because when your life is that miserable, drinking yourself into oblivion has a certain appeal. The long hours and sleep deprivation led to accidents. Bakers fell into ovens, cut themselves with knives, dropped heavy equipment on their feet, and generally hurt themselves at rates that would make modern occupational safety officers weep. Thomas had seen a journeyman lose 3 fingers in a dough mixing machine that should never have been operating while someone's hand was near it. He'd seen an apprentice trip while carrying a tray of hot loaves and end up with third-degree burns across his chest and arms. He'd seen men collapse from exhaustion and have to be carried out of the bakehouse, while Josiah shouted about lazy workers and how they'd be docked pay for the time they spent unconscious. There was no workers' compensation, no health insurance, no safety net of any kind. If you were injured on the job, you lost wages while you recovered, and if the injury was severe enough to prevent you from working, you became dependent on charity or the dreaded workhouse. The workhouse was the ultimate horror for Victorian working-class people, a last resort that separated families, provided minimal food and shelter, and worked inmates in conditions that were deliberately made harsh to discourage people from seeking help. Thomas would rather die in the bakehouse than end up in the workhouse, and that wasn't hyperbole. But it wasn't all misery, or at least Thomas tried to convince himself it wasn't. There was satisfaction in the work, in taking flour and water and yeast and creating something essential, something that fed people. There was craft in baking, real skill that required years to develop. A well-baked loaf was a small work of art, with its golden crust, its soft interior, its subtle flavor. Thomas took pride in his work, even when that work was killing him by inches. There was also camaraderie among the bakers, the other journeymen, the apprentices, even Josiah in his better moments. They understood each other in a way that outsiders couldn't. They shared jokes, stories, complaints, and occasional moments of genuine friendship. When one of the apprentices had been caught stealing bread to feed his starving mother, Thomas and the other journeymen had taken up a small collection to help the family, even though they could barely afford it themselves. When a journeyman's wife had died in childbirth, everyone had contributed what they could for the funeral. There was solidarity in shared suffering. The political situation for bakers began to change in the 1850s and 1860s, though change came slowly and was bitterly fought by employers. Reformers like Charles Dickens had started writing about the conditions in London bakehouses, describing them as health hazards and comparing them to the worst industrial factories. Medical reports documented the high mortality rates among bakers, the respiratory diseases, the terrible working conditions. Slowly, very slowly, public opinion began to shift. The first factory acts had applied only to textile mills and didn't cover bakeries at all. Bakers were excluded from most labour protections because their industry was classified as domestic service rather than manufacturing, which was a convenient fiction that allowed employers to continue exploiting their workers without regulation. But by the 1860s, there was growing pressure to extend some kind of protections to bakers. Thomas followed these developments with interest, reading whatever newspapers he could get his hands on, though his reading was slow and laborious, because his education had been so limited. He attended a few meetings of a nascent bakers' organization that was trying to push for regulations on working hours and bakehouse conditions. The meetings were poorly attended because most bakers were too exhausted to show up, and also because employers had been known to fire workers they suspected of union activities. The breakthrough came with the Bakehouse Regulation Act of 1863, which was wildly ambitious in its goals and wildly inadequate in its implementation. The Act required that bakehouses be inspected for sanitation, that they have proper ventilation, and that young people under 18 not be worked more than 12 hours a day. 12 hours was considered the generous limit. The fact that this was seen as progress tells you everything about Victorian labour standards. The problem was enforcement. The Act provided for inspectors, but there weren't nearly enough of them to actually inspect all the bakehouses in London, let alone the rest of England. Inspectors could be bribed. Employers could clean up their bakehouses for inspection day and go right back to the usual squalor afterward. And the penalties for violations were minimal, just small fines that most employers considered a cost of doing business. Josiah Crumb had responded to the Act by making absolutely no changes whatsoever to his bakehouse, and then expressing shock and outrage when an inspector actually showed up and cited him for violations. The inspector had documented the lack of ventilation, the presence of rats, the fact that flour and coal were stored in the same area, and the absence of any separate sleeping quarters for apprentices. Josiah had paid the fine, grumbled about government overreach, and then continued operating exactly as before. The inspector never came back. The question of work hours was even more contentious. The Act didn't actually limit adult work hours at all, and the 12-hour limit for young people was routinely ignored. How could you run a bakery on 12-hour shifts when the baking schedule required 18 hours of work? The economics simply didn't work, or at least that's what every master baker claimed. Thomas suspected they were exaggerating, that it would actually be possible to organize shifts more efficiently and hire more workers, but that would cut into profits, and profits were sacred. Some of the larger bakeries, the ones supplying major retailers or operating multiple locations, did start experimenting with shift work. Instead of having workers do marathon sessions, they'd have a night shift and a day shift, each working maybe 10 or 12 hours. This was better, marginally, but it still meant working through the night for half the workforce, and it required hiring more workers, which most small operations couldn't or wouldn't do. Thomas dreamed of a bakery that operated on reasonable hours, that employed enough people to spread the work around, that actually followed the regulations. But he knew it was a fantasy. The economics of working-class bread production were too tight. Margins were too thin. Competition was too fierce. Any master baker who suddenly decided to double his workforce and improve conditions would immediately be undercut by competitors and driven out of business. It was a race to the bottom, and the only way to stop it was comprehensive regulation that applied to everyone equally. But that kind of regulation faced massive opposition from the baking industry and their political allies. The adulteration problem also began to receive attention in this period. In 1860, a food analyst named John Postgate published a report on bread adulteration that shocked the public. He'd tested bread samples from bakeries across London and found that virtually all of them contained alum. Many contained other additives as well. Some of the samples were genuinely dangerous, containing levels of adulterants that could cause acute poisoning. The Adulteration of Food Act of 1860 made it illegal to add harmful substances to food, but enforcement was, once again, nearly non-existent. The law required that adulterants be disclosed, but bakers simply didn't disclose them and faced no real consequences. Local authorities were supposed to prosecute violators, but prosecutions required chemical analysis, which cost money, and local authorities weren't willing to spend money on protecting the food supply of the poor. Thomas was in a difficult position regarding adulteration. He knew it was wrong. He knew the bread he helped make was inferior and potentially harmful. But he also knew that pure bread would be more expensive, and his customers couldn't afford more expensive bread. They were living on the edge of starvation already. If bread prices went up, people would go hungry. So he participated in the system, added the alum when Josiah told him to, and tried not to think too much about the children eating this adulterated bread. The industry arguments against regulation were remarkably cynical. Master bakers would claim that customers actually preferred white bread, and that alum was necessary to make bread white. They'd claim that adulterants were harmless in small quantities, conveniently ignoring that people ate bread every day, meaning small quantities accumulated. They'd claim that regulation would drive up prices and hurt the poor, which was true, but also a deflection from the fact that they were already hurting the poor by selling them poisoned bread. Some bakers tried to market themselves as selling pure bread, but they struggled to compete. Their bread was more expensive and often less white, which customers interpreted as inferior quality. There was a whole perverse education problem where working-class consumers had been conditioned to equate white bread with quality, even though darker bread made from less refined flour was actually more nutritious. But nutrition wasn't well understood in the 1860s, and consumer education was non-existent, so the market continued to favor cheap, white, adulterated bread. The 1870s brought more reforms, though still incremental. The Factory and Workshop Act of 1878 finally included bakehouses and set some actual limits on work hours, though these were still far longer than modern labor standards would consider acceptable. The Act limited women and children to a 12-hour workday and required 1/2 day off per week. Adult men were still exempt from hour restrictions, because apparently adult men didn't need sleep or rest. Thomas was in his 50s by this point, and his body was failing in the predictable ways. His asthma was so bad that he could barely walk upstairs without stopping to catch his breath. His hands were gnarled and stiff with arthritis. His back was permanently bent from decades of kneading dough. He looked 20 years older than his actual age, and he knew that his working life was coming to an end. The question was whether he'd die in the bakehouse or survive long enough to become a burden on his family. Retirement wasn't really an option for working-class Victorians. There were no pensions, no social security, no savings to fall back on, because there had never been enough money to save anything. When Thomas could no longer work, he'd become dependent on his children, assuming his children could support themselves, which wasn't guaranteed. The alternative was the workhouse, and Thomas had already decided he'd rather die. His eldest son had indeed apprenticed as a baker, which broke Thomas's heart even as he helped the boy get the position. The son seemed to be handling it better than Thomas had, or maybe he was just younger and hadn't accumulated enough damage yet. The other son had found work as a general labourer, which was grueling in its own way, but at least didn't involve breathing flour dust for 18 hours a day. The daughter had gone into domestic service, which meant she was working for a middle-class family, cleaning and cooking, and essentially being available at all hours. But at least she had a roof over her head and regular meals. Margaret had aged as badly as Thomas, though for different reasons. The stress of managing poverty, of stretching pennies, of watching her husband slowly die from his work, of burying 2 children, it had worn her down. She was only 50 but looked 70. Her hands were rough from washing and cleaning. Her face was lined with worry. They'd been married for 30 years and had spent most of that time just trying to survive. Romance and affection were luxuries they couldn't afford. They cared for each other in the way that longtime partners do, but there wasn't much joy in their relationship, just exhaustion and determination. Thomas tried to imagine what life might have been like in a different world. What if he'd been born into a middle-class family, gone to university, become a clerk or an accountant or a teacher? What if there had been real labor protections when he was young, reasonable hours, safe working conditions? What if the system hadn't been designed to extract maximum labor for minimum wages? But these thoughts were pointless. He'd been born into the class and circumstances he'd been born into, and there had been no real possibility of escape. The late Victorian period did see the beginning of real change, though Thomas wouldn't live to see most of it. The trade union movement was growing. The Labour Party would eventually be formed. Social reform movements were pushing for better working conditions, shorter hours, minimum wages, and safety standards. The terrible conditions in bakeries and other industries were being documented, publicized, and slowly, painfully, addressed through legislation. But change came too late for Thomas and the thousands of other Victorian bakers who'd spent their lives in underground hellholes, breathing poison, working themselves to death for barely enough money to survive. Their suffering was the foundation on which later reforms were built. Their stories, documented by reformers and journalists, provided the ammunition for political campaigns. Their deaths from asthma and other occupational diseases created the statistical evidence that something had to change. The irony was that bread itself, the product of all this suffering, was genuinely important. Bread was the staple food of Victorian England, especially for the working class. It provided the bulk of their calories, such as they were. When bread was scarce or expensive, people went hungry. When bread was adulterated, people got sick, but at least they had something to eat. Thomas and his fellow bakers were performing essential labor, feeding the nation, and they were being destroyed in the process. The class dynamics of Victorian baking were particularly stark. The wealthy ate bread too, of course, but their bread came from exclusive bakeries that charged premium prices and actually used pure ingredients. These upscale establishments had proper facilities, reasonable hours for their workers, and didn't need to resort to adulteration because their customers could afford to pay what quality bread actually cost. The bakers who worked in these establishments were skilled artisans, treated with some respect, paid decent wages. They were still working long hours, still breathing flour dust, but the degree of exploitation was notably less. Meanwhile, the vast majority of bakers, like Thomas, were serving the working poor, competing in a market where every penny mattered, where the choice was between adulterating or going bankrupt. The system was designed to transfer suffering downward. The poor ate poisoned bread because they couldn't afford anything better. The bakers who made that bread worked themselves to death because they couldn't afford to demand better conditions. The master bakers operated horrible bakeries because margins were too thin to do otherwise. And at the top, the mill owners, the property owners, the politicians, they profited from the whole arrangement while bearing none of the costs. Thomas understood this instinctively, even if he couldn't articulate it in political terms. He knew that the system was rigged, that the deck was stacked, that he'd never been given a fair chance. But what could he do about it? Individual resistance was pointless. Refusing to work just meant starving faster. Complaining got you branded as a troublemaker and made it harder to find employment. The only real solution was collective action, organization, political power, and those things were only just beginning to emerge in the 1870s and 1880s. The temperance movement had complicated feelings about bakers, because so many bakers drank heavily. The reformers saw drinking as a moral failing, an individual weakness. What they failed to understand, or refused to understand, was that drinking was a rational response to unbearable conditions. When your life is 18 hours of brutal labor, 6 hours of inadequate sleep, and a few hours of existence, too exhausted to do anything meaningful, alcohol provides temporary relief. It's not healthy, it's not sustainable, but it's understandable. Thomas drank more than he should have, and he knew it, but he also knew that those few pints at the pub were sometimes the only pleasant moments in his week. The pub was also one of the few social spaces available to working-class men. The home was too small, too crowded, too depressing. There were no community centres, no parks worth mentioning, no public libraries. The pub offered warmth, companionship, escape from the grinding poverty outside. Thomas would meet other bakers there, other working men, and they'd share complaints, tell stories, occasionally discuss politics or sports, or anything that wasn't their awful jobs. These were important moments of human connection, in lives otherwise dominated by isolation and labour. Margaret disapproved of his drinking, but she didn't nag him about it the way some wives did. She understood that he needed something, some relief valve, and if it was beer, rather than something worse, she could live with that. Their marriage had long since evolved past any illusions of changing each other. They were partners in survival, and survival required compromises, acceptance of imperfections, focusing on what mattered. What mattered was keeping food on the table and a roof overhead, and Thomas's drinking, while not helping, wasn't preventing those basic necessities from being met. The children's education, such as it was, came mostly from Sunday school, which provided basic literacy and a heavy dose of religious instruction. The churches saw working-class children as potential converts and future congregants, so they were willing to invest some resources in education. The quality varied wildly depending on the church and the teachers. Some Sunday schools were genuinely trying to help children learn. Others were more focused on indoctrination and social control, teaching children to accept their station in life and not question authority. Thomas's daughter had actually learned to read quite well at Sunday school, well enough that she could read simple books and newspapers. This was unusual and valuable. Literacy opened up possibilities, even if those possibilities were constrained by class and gender. She'd used her reading skills to improve her position in domestic service, moving from a general maid to a lady's maid, which was a step up in pay and status. It wasn't much, but it was something, and in the Victorian working class, you took whatever small improvements you could get. The food that Thomas's family ate was as monotonous as it was inadequate. Breakfast was bread and tea, with maybe butter or drippings if they could afford it. Lunch was bread and cheese, or bread and cold meat, if there was any. Dinner was bread with soup or stew, heavy on the potatoes and cabbage, light on the actual meat. Bread appeared at every meal, because bread was cheap, filling, and Thomas could bring home old loaves from the bakehouse. The irony that a baker's family ate so much bread, and that the bread was adulterated poison, was not lost on Thomas. Fresh vegetables were expensive and spoiled quickly without refrigeration. Fruit was a luxury reserved for special occasions. Meat was bought in small quantities and stretched as far as possible. Margaret was skilled at making a small amount of meat flavour, an entire pot of stew, but that didn't change the fact that the family was chronically undernourished. They consumed enough calories to function, barely, but they were deficient in vitamins, minerals, and protein. This led to various health problems, stunted growth in the children, anemia, dental issues, and general susceptibility to disease. The housing situation was precarious in ways that modern people would find difficult to comprehend. Thomas and Margaret rented their rooms on a weekly basis. They had no lease, no security, no protections against eviction. If they fell behind on rent, even by a single week, the landlord could throw them out immediately. This had almost happened twice, once when Thomas was too sick to work for a week, and once when Margaret needed medical care that cost money they didn't have. Both times, they'd scrambled to borrow money from relatives, from neighbours, from anyone who might help, and had managed to pay the back rent just in time. The threat of eviction hung over them constantly. It was a sword of Damocles that influenced every decision. They couldn't spend money on anything non-essential because they might need that money for rent. They couldn't afford to get sick or injured because lost wages meant missed rent. They couldn't save for emergencies because there was nothing left after paying rent and buying food. The system kept them perpetually on the edge, one crisis away from homelessness. The workhouse loomed as the ultimate threat. If Thomas couldn't work, if Margaret couldn't manage, if the children couldn't contribute, the family would be broken up and sent to the workhouse. Families were separated because men, women, and children were housed in different sections. The conditions were deliberately harsh to discourage people from seeking help. Inmates wore uniforms, worked long hours at work tasks, ate terrible food, and were treated with contempt by the overseers. The workhouse represented the complete failure of the Victorian social system to provide any kind of safety net, and everyone knew it. Thomas had visited the workhouse once to see an old friend who'd ended up there after becoming too disabled to work. The experience had been traumatic. His friend had been gaunt, hollow-eyed, broken. The man barely recognized Thomas. He spoke in whispers about the regime, the rules, the punishments for minor infractions. He begged Thomas to bring him food, anything, because the workhouse rations were starvation level. Thomas had brought what he could spare, which wasn't much, and left feeling sick and determined to never, ever end up in such a place. The medical care available to working-class Victorians was minimal and often dangerous. Doctors cost money, so people avoided them unless absolutely desperate. There were charity hospitals, but these were overcrowded, undersupplied, and staffed by doctors who were often learning their craft on poor patients. Anesthesia was still relatively new and not always available. Antiseptic technique was barely understood. Surgery was a last resort because the mortality rate was so high. Thomas had been to a charity hospital once for the burn incident I mentioned earlier. The experience had been nightmarish. He'd waited for hours in a crowded room full of sick and injured people. The doctor who eventually treated him had been brusque and dismissive. The treatment had been painful and only marginally effective. The burn had healed, eventually, but it had left extensive scarring, and Thomas had been lucky it hadn't become infected, which would probably have killed him. Most health problems were treated at home with whatever remedies people could afford or concoct. Willow bark tea for pain, poultices for wounds, prayer for everything else. Margaret had a collection of folk remedies passed down from her mother, some of which probably helped, and some of which were useless or harmful. There was no way to know which was which, because there was no scientific basis for any of it. You tried things and hoped for the best. The children suffered from the usual array of childhood diseases: measles, whooping cough, scarlet fever. 2 had died, as I mentioned. The 3 who survived had done so partly through luck and partly through Margaret's determined nursing. She'd sat up nights with feverish children, cooling them with wet cloths, forcing them to drink water, praying they'd make it through. The fact that most children survived into adulthood was actually remarkable given the disease environment and poor nutrition. Dental care was non-existent for the working class. Thomas had lost several teeth to decay and infection. The pain had been excruciating until the teeth finally fell out, which was actually a relief. He couldn't afford a dentist, and even if he could, Victorian dentistry was primitive and painful. Margaret had worse teeth than Thomas. which was common for women who'd borne multiple children. Pregnancy depleted calcium and other nutrients, leading to dental problems that were never treated. By middle age, many working-class people had few teeth left, which made eating difficult and contributed to malnutrition. The physical appearance of working-class Victorians was noticeably different from the middle and upper classes. Chronic malnutrition led to shorter stature, less body mass, worse skin, and generally unhealthy appearance. The poor looked poor in ways that were immediately visible. Their clothes were worn and patched. Their posture was bent from hard labor. Their faces were lined with stress and hardship. The class divide was literally written on people's bodies. Thomas was 5 feet 6 inches tall, which was average for working-class men of his generation, but several inches shorter than middle-class men who'd grown up with better nutrition. His weight fluctuated around 140 pounds, less than ideal for his height. His face was gaunt, his cheekbones prominent. His hair had gone grey prematurely and was thinning. He looked like what he was, a man being slowly consumed by his circumstances. The few pleasures available to Thomas and his family were simple and mostly free. Walking in the park on Sunday, when weather permitted. Watching street entertainers. Occasionally attending a music hall show, though tickets cost money they usually couldn't spare. Reading the newspaper when Thomas could get his hands on one. Margaret enjoyed going to church. Not because she was particularly devout, but because it was social. It got her out of the cramped rooms, and it provided some sense of community. The children played in the streets with other neighborhood children, inventing games that required no equipment. Hide-and-seek tag. Marbles when they could afford marbles. The streets of Victorian London were dangerous for children, with horse traffic, open sewers, and predators both human and animal, but they were also the only play space available. Parents couldn't hover and supervise because parents were working. Children developed independence and street smarts early because they had to. Christmas was the one time of year when Thomas's family tried to do something special. They couldn't afford much, but Margaret would save pennies throughout the year to buy small gifts. Maybe some candy or fruit, a small toy for the youngest. They'd have a slightly better meal than usual, maybe a small piece of beef, or a chicken if they'd saved enough. Thomas would have Christmas Eve off, one of the few nights of the year when he didn't work. The family would stay up together, sing carols, tell stories. These were precious memories that sustained them through the rest of the year's grinding monotony. Religion played an ambiguous role in Victorian working-class life. The established Church of England was largely irrelevant to the poor, seen as an institution of the middle and upper classes, but various nonconformist churches, Methodist, Baptist, Congregationalist, actively courted working-class congregations. These churches provided not just spiritual comfort, but practical assistance, food banks, clothing donations, help with rent in emergencies. They also provided community, a sense of belonging to something larger than yourself. Thomas was nominally Anglican, but rarely attended church except for Christmas and Easter. He found the services boring and couldn't shake the feeling that the clergy looked down on working people. Margaret was more religiously inclined and attended Methodist services regularly. She found genuine comfort in the hymns, the sermons, the fellowship with other women. The church told her that her suffering had meaning, that God saw her struggles, that there would be rewards in the afterlife. Thomas wasn't sure he believed any of that, but he didn't begrudge Margaret her faith. If it helped her cope, that was valuable. The question of meaning, of purpose, was one that Thomas struggled with in his rare moments of reflection. What was the point of all this? Working himself to death to make bread that barely kept people alive, bread that was poisoned with adulterants, bread that made him sick to produce. His life was consumption without production of anything truly valuable. He was a cog in a machine that ground up human beings and spit out profits for people he'd never meet. But he couldn't afford to think this way too much, because despair was paralyzing, and he had to keep functioning. He had a family to support. He had responsibilities. Giving up wasn't an option, so he pushed the existential questions aside and focused on the immediate. Getting through the next shift, making it to the next payday, surviving another week. This was the working class Victorian mindset. Narrow focus on survival, no energy for philosophy or questioning the system. The technological changes happening in the broader Victorian society largely bypassed people like Thomas. The railways existed, but Thomas never travelled anywhere because he couldn't afford tickets and couldn't take time off. The telegraph existed, but Thomas had no one to telegraph and couldn't have afforded it anyway. Gas lighting was becoming common, but Thomas's rooms still used candles because gas cost money. The Industrial Revolution was transforming Britain, creating enormous wealth. But that wealth was concentrating at the top, while the people actually doing the work saw little benefit. There were occasional moments when Thomas glimpsed the wealth and luxury of the upper classes, and these moments were jarring. Once, delivering a special order to a wealthy household in Mayfair, he'd seen rooms larger than his entire building. Carpets that probably cost more than he'd earn in a lifetime. A chandelier with more candles than he'd burn in a year. The contrast was so extreme, it seemed like a different species lived there, not just a different class. The wealthy customer had barely acknowledged Thomas, treating him as a piece of furniture that happened to deliver bread. This was typical. Working people were largely invisible to the upper classes, except as servants and labourers. The idea that bakers were human beings with families and struggles and dignity never seemed to occur to the rich customers. They paid for bread and expected it to appear. The people who made it irrelevant except as means of production. Thomas didn't hate the rich, exactly, though he certainly resented them. Mostly he felt a kind of numb acceptance that the world was unfair and always had been and probably always would be. The Victorian class system seemed as permanent and unchangeable as the weather. You could complain about it, but what good did that do? The sun rose and set, the rich got richer, the poor got ground down. That was just how things were. But by the 1880s, cracks were appearing in this worldview. The labour movement was organising. Strikes were becoming more common. Workers were starting to demand rights, limitations on hours, minimum wages, safety regulations. The Liberal Party, and later the Labour Party, were taking up working class causes. Change was possible, maybe, if enough people pushed for it. Thomas was too old and too tired to be an activist. But he watched these developments with interest and cautious hope. Maybe things would be better for his children or grandchildren. Maybe the system could be reformed. Maybe bread could be made in decent conditions by people earning fair wages. It seemed unlikely. But stranger things had happened. The Factory and Workshop Act of 1891 finally prohibited night work for young people in bakeries and required proper sanitation. This was real progress, though enforcement remained spotty. Some master bakers complied. Others ignored the law and paid fines when caught. Josiah Crumb had actually made some improvements, installing better ventilation and creating separate sleeping quarters for apprentices, though whether this was out of conscience or fear of fines was debatable. Thomas was in his 60s now, ancient by working class standards. His asthma was so severe he could barely walk across a room without gasping for breath. His hands were useless for fine work. His back was so bent he couldn't stand fully upright. He should have retired years ago. But retirement required having somewhere to go and some way to support himself, neither of which he had. So he kept working, doing lighter tasks, helping where he could, trying to remain useful enough that Josiah wouldn't fire him. The other journeyman treated him with respect, even kindness. He was the old man of the bakehouse, the veteran who'd survived longer than most. The younger men would ask his advice, help him when he struggled with physical tasks, cover for him when he needed extra breaks. This solidarity, this mutual support among workers, was one of the few bright spots in an otherwise dark system. Margaret was also failing. She'd developed dropsy. fluid retention that caused painful swelling in her legs and abdomen. She couldn't move around much anymore, couldn't do the housework, couldn't manage the household the way she once had. The daughter had taken over most of these tasks, but the daughter had her own job, her own life, and couldn't be there all the time. The family was holding together through determination and mutual support, but it was fragile. One crisis away from collapse. Thomas's eldest son, the one who'd become a baker, was doing better than Thomas had at the same age, partly because conditions had improved slightly and partly because he was just lucky. He'd found work in one of the newer, larger bakeries that operated on shifts and had proper facilities. He wasn't getting rich, but he wasn't being destroyed either. He had hopes of eventually becoming a master baker himself, maybe running a small shop. These were modest ambitions, but they represented upward mobility, the possibility that the next generation might do better. The other son, the labourer, had married and had children of his own. Thomas was a grandfather, though he barely knew his grandchildren because he was always working or sleeping. The few times he'd seen them, they'd seemed healthy and energetic, and that was enough. He didn't need to be close to them. He just needed to know they existed, that the family line continued, that his life had produced something beyond more bread and more suffering. On his rare days off, usually just Sundays now, because even Josiah couldn't justify working a man in his condition 6 days a week, Thomas would sit by the window and watch the street below. He'd see people going about their business, children playing, vendors hurrying their wares, life happening. He felt disconnected from all of it, a ghost observing from outside. His life had been spent underground, in darkness and heat and flour dust, while the world went on above. He thought about death more often now, not in a morbid way, just practically. He knew he didn't have much time left. The asthma would eventually suffocate him, or his heart would give out, or he'd have an accident in the bakehouse. The how didn't matter much. What mattered was what would happen to Margaret, and whether the children would be okay. He'd tried to prepare them, though there wasn't much he could do. He had no savings, no property, no inheritance to leave. Just debts, really. And the hope that the children were strong enough to manage without him. The Victorian attitude toward death was different from modern sensibilities. Death was common, expected, familiar. People died at home, surrounded by family. Bodies were prepared by family members, waked in the home, then buried in increasingly crowded cemeteries. There was ritual around death, mourning periods, black clothing, elaborate funerals for those who could afford them. But underlying all the ritual was acceptance. Death happened. You mourned and moved on because there was no alternative. Thomas had attended many funerals over the years, friends, relatives, co-workers. Bakers died young, usually from respiratory failure or heart attacks. There would be a service, a few words about the deceased, prayers, then burial in a pauper's section of a cemetery where plots were reused after a few years. The dead weren't allowed to take up too much space. The living needed room too. He wondered what his own funeral would be like. Probably small, modest, attended by family and a few old friends. Someone would say he was a hard worker, a decent man, a good husband and father. These were the standard eulogies for working-class men. Nothing special, nothing memorable, just a life lived and ended. Then he'd be buried. Probably in a shared plot, because individual plots cost money the family wouldn't have. And eventually his bones would be dug up to make room for someone else. That was the cycle. But Thomas didn't want to end on a depressing note. Even in his own thoughts. His life had been hard, yes, brutally so. He'd been exploited, poisoned, worked nearly to death. He'd never had enough money, enough rest, enough time with his family. The system had been rigged against him from birth. But he'd survived. He'd raised children who had better lives than he'd had. He'd done honest work, however terrible the conditions. He'd maintained his dignity and his humanity in circumstances designed to crush both. And things were changing. Slowly, inadequately, but changing nonetheless. The reforms he'd seen in his lifetime, the factory acts, the food safety laws, the beginnings of labor organization, they were real progress. The next generation of bakers would have it better. The generation after that might have it better still. Eventually, maybe decades or centuries from now, baking might be a decent profession with fair wages and safe conditions and reasonable hours. Thomas wouldn't live to see it. But it gave him some comfort to think that his suffering, and the suffering of thousands like him, might eventually lead to something better, on particularly bad nights, when his lungs were tight and his body ached, and he wanted nothing more than to sleep, but couldn't because the work had to be done. Thomas would think about bread itself. Not the adulterated poison he helped produce, but real bread, the kind made from pure flour and water and yeast. The kind that had sustained human civilization for millennia. There was something almost sacred about bread, about taking simple ingredients and transforming them into food. The alchemy of baking, the way yeast brought dough to life, the way heat turned pale dough into golden crust, it was remarkable. In a better world, baking would be respected as the craft it was. Bakers would be valued for their skill and their essential labor. They'd work reasonable hours in decent conditions and earn enough to live comfortably. Their product would be pure, nutritious, affordable. Food would be a right, not a luxury. But Thomas didn't live in a better world. He lived in Victorian England, where workers were exploited and food was adulterated, and the system ground people down for profit. The bakehouse where Thomas had spent most of his adult life was, in many ways, a microcosm of Victorian industrial capitalism. It was a place where labor was extracted through coercion, economic necessity really, but coercion nonetheless. It was a place where profit was prioritized over human welfare. It was a place where regulations existed, but weren't enforced. It was a place where workers had no power, no voice, no ability to change their circumstances. And yet it was also a place where essential work was done, where food was produced, where people struggled and occasionally succeeded in maintaining their dignity. Thomas's story wasn't unique. Thousands of bakers across Victorian England lived similar lives, worked similar hours, suffered similar health problems, died similar premature deaths. Their individual stories were forgotten, lost to history, because working class lives weren't considered worth documenting. But collectively, their experiences mattered. They were the people who fed industrial Britain. They were the invisible infrastructure of Victorian society. And their suffering eventually catalyzed the reforms that improved conditions for future workers. The Victorian era was a time of tremendous progress and terrible exploitation, often simultaneously. The same society that built railways and telegraphs and great industrial empires also worked children in coal mines and poisoned bread and let workers die from preventable occupational diseases. The wealth and power that made Britain a global superpower was built on the backs of people like Thomas, people who never shared in the prosperity they created. Looking back from the distance of more than a century, it's easy to judge Victorian society harshly. How could they tolerate such conditions? How could they allow such exploitation? But people within the system often couldn't see alternatives. The economic logic seemed inexorable. Competition required cutting costs. Cutting costs required minimizing wages and maximizing hours. The market demanded cheap bread. Cheap bread required adulteration and exploitation. Anyone who tried to break this cycle would be driven out of business. Change required collective action, political will, and a fundamental reimagining of how society should be organized. That reimagining was happening in Thomas's lifetime, but slowly, incompletely. The Victorian reformers, the social critics, the labor organizers, they were planting seeds that would eventually grow into the welfare state and modern labor protections. But the growth was gradual, and people like Thomas suffered in the meantime. The irony was that Victorian Britain was wealthy enough to treat its workers better. The technology existed to make bakeries safer. The agricultural production existed to make food adulteration unnecessary. The knowledge existed to understand that 18-hour workdays were harmful. What was lacking was the political and social will to prioritize human welfare over profit. The system worked for the people at the top, so why change it? Thomas had a complicated relationship with Britain and British identity. On one hand, he was proud to be British, proud of the empire. The military victories, the industrial achievements. These were sources of national pride that cut across class lines. On the other hand, he understood viscerally that Britishness meant different things, depending on your social position. For the wealthy, being British meant privilege, power, opportunity. For Thomas, being British meant exhaustion, exploitation, and early death. The pub conversations he'd had over the years often touched on politics, though working class men had limited ability to influence political outcomes. The Reform Acts had gradually expanded voting rights, but full male suffrage wouldn't come until after Thomas's death, and women's suffrage would take even longer. Still, working men had opinions. They followed elections, debated issues, formed political allegiances even when they couldn't vote. Thomas leaned liberal, insofar as he had political views, because the liberals at least pretended to care about working class issues. The Conservatives were openly the party of the wealthy. The emerging labour movement appealed to him, but it was still too new and too radical for his generation. He'd spent his whole life learning to accept his place in the social order. The idea that workers could actually seize power and reshape society seemed fantastical, though he hoped the younger generation might pull it off. The newspaper reports about conditions in bakeries had been both validating and frustrating for Thomas. Validating because finally someone was acknowledging what he'd known his entire working life, that the bakehouse was killing him. Frustrating because the reports were often sensationalized, focused on the most extreme cases, and seemed to position bakers as victims rather than workers with agency. Thomas didn't want pity. He wanted fair wages, reasonable hours, and safe working conditions. He wanted dignity. Some of the reformers who wrote about bakehouse conditions were genuinely concerned about worker welfare. Others seemed more interested in food safety and protecting middle-class consumers from adulterated bread. This was typical of Victorian reform movements. They often couched worker protections in terms of protecting the broader public, because apparently workers themselves weren't reason enough to care. If you wanted to pass legislation, you had to argue that bad conditions for workers would somehow harm respectable people. The children Thomas had seen grow up around him, the neighborhood kids who'd played in the streets, had followed various paths. Some had died young from disease or accident. Some had emigrated, seeking better opportunities in America or Australia or Canada. Some had stayed and were repeating their parents' patterns, entering trades, marrying young, having children, struggling to survive. A few had managed to rise into the lower middle class through education or luck, or exceptional determination. Thomas's own children represented this range of outcomes. The baker son was solidly working class, but doing better than Thomas had. The labourer son was barely getting by. The daughter in domestic service had prospects of rising to housekeeper someday, which would mean slightly better pay and more security. None of them would be wealthy, but none of them would experience quite the level of degradation Thomas had endured. That was progress, modest but real. The question of what advice Thomas would give to someone entering the baking trade in the 1890s was complicated. On one hand, there was steady demand for bread, so employment was relatively secure. The recent reforms had made conditions somewhat better. With skill and luck, a baker might even become a master baker and run his own shop. On the other hand, the work was still brutal, still unhealthy, still poorly paid relative to the hours required. Thomas would probably advise learning a trade with better prospects if possible. But if baking was the only option, at least there were now some protections. The relationship between master bakers and journeymen was inherently adversarial in some ways, though personal relationships complicated this. Josiah Crumb was Thomas's exploiter, the man who profited from Thomas's labor while paying minimal wages and maintaining dangerous conditions. But Josiah was also someone Thomas had worked alongside for decades, someone he knew as a person with his own struggles and frustrations. Josiah wasn't wealthy. He wasn't living in luxury. He was caught in the same economic trap as Thomas, just one level up. This was the insidious nature of capitalist exploitation in Victorian England. It wasn't always evil overseers deliberately harming workers. Often it was people like Josiah, trying to survive in a competitive market, making compromises that harmed others because the alternative was going bankrupt themselves. The system created perverse incentives that turned people against each other, worker against master, baker against baker, all competing for scraps while the real wealth went elsewhere. If Thomas had one regret, it was that he'd never travelled, never seen anything beyond London and the immediate surroundings. The world was much larger than his experience of it. There were places where workers were treated better, or at least differently. There were experiments in cooperative ownership and socialist organisation. There were new ideas about how society could be structured. But Thomas would never see any of it. His world was the bakehouse, the walk home, the cramped rooms, the pub, the church, a radius of maybe 2 miles that contained his entire lived experience. Books were another world he'd only glimpsed. Thomas could read, but slowly and with difficulty. He'd read a few novels over the years, borrowed or bought cheaply secondhand. Dickens, of course, everyone read Dickens. The stories about working class life resonated. Though Thomas thought Dickens sometimes softened the reality, made poverty seem more romantic than it actually was. Still, it was validating to see his world represented in literature, to know that someone thought working class lives were worth writing about. The music halls were one of the few entertainment options accessible to the working class. Thomas had been a few times over the years, usually for special occasions. The shows were rowdy, bawdy, energetic, very different from the refined entertainment of the middle classes. The songs were about everyday life, love affairs, drinking, work, politics, all delivered with humour and sentiment. The audiences participated, singing along, heckling performers, creating a communal experience that was genuinely fun. These moments of joy and entertainment were important because they provided relief from the grinding monotony of work and poverty. Humans need more than just survival. They need beauty, laughter, connection, meaning. The Victorian working class created their own culture, their own forms of entertainment and expression, despite having minimal resources. This creativity and resilience was remarkable. Thomas thought sometimes about what he'd tell his younger self if he could send a message back in time. Work less. But there was no option to work less. Choose a different trade. But opportunities had been limited. Save money. But there had never been money to save. The advice he kept coming back to was simple: be kind to your family. Find moments of joy where you can. Accept what you can't change. And fight for what you can. That was about as much wisdom as his experience had generated. The physical space of the bakehouse had become so familiar to Thomas that he could navigate it in complete darkness, which he sometimes had to do when the gas lamps failed or weren't lit to save money. He knew every crack in the floor, every worn spot on the equipment, every quirk of the ovens. The space was oppressive, dangerous, and toxic, but it was also where he'd spent the majority of his adult waking hours. He had a complicated relationship with it, something between hatred and familiarity. When Thomas died, which he did in the spring of 1894, it was from respiratory failure, his lungs finally giving up after decades of abuse. He died at home, not in the bakehouse, which was a small mercy. Margaret was with him, as were the children. He was 63 years old, which was actually longer than many bakers lived. His last words were apparently mundane, something about whether someone had remembered to pay the rent. Even in death, the practical concerns of survival dominated. The funeral was small, as Thomas had predicted. The family couldn't afford much. A simple coffin, A brief service, burial in a shared plot. Josiah Crumb attended, which was decent of him, and paid for a funeral wreath, which was more than strictly necessary. The other journeyman came, took up a collection for Margaret, and shared stories about Thomas. He was remembered as a skilled baker, a reliable worker, a good man who'd endured terrible conditions with dignity. Margaret survived Thomas by 2 years, then succumbed to the dropsy and general exhaustion. The children divided what little there was, mainly some clothes and a few personal items. There was no property, no savings, no inheritance. The parents' legacy was their survival and the fact that they'd raised children who had marginally better prospects. That was the sum total of 2 lives spent in hard labour. The bakehouse where Thomas worked continued operating for another decade, before finally closing. Unable to compete with larger industrial bakeries that could produce bread more cheaply through economies of scale, the building was eventually torn down and replaced with a tenement. No plaque marked the spot where thousands of loaves had been baked and where men like Thomas had slowly destroyed their health. But the story of Victorian bakers didn't end with Thomas's death. The reforms that had begun in his lifetime continued and accelerated. The early 20th century brought more comprehensive factory legislation, stronger enforcement, and eventually the rise of labour unions that could actually negotiate for better conditions. The 8-hour workday became standard. Night baking for young people was fully prohibited and actually enforced. Bakehouse sanitation improved dramatically. Food adulteration became rarer as regulations tightened and enforcement improved. The technology of baking also changed. Mechanical mixers eliminated the need for bakers to physically knead hundreds of pounds of dough. Better ovens with temperature controls made the work less dangerous. Electric lighting made underground bakehouses less grim. Refrigeration allowed for better ingredient storage and reduced spoilage. These weren't revolutionary changes, but incremental improvements that collectively made baking less of a death sentence. The social safety net expanded too, though slowly. The Old Age Pensions Act of 1908 provided minimal support for elderly people. Though the amounts were too small to live on, and the age requirement was 70, which many workers didn't reach. The National Insurance Act of 1911 provided some health insurance and unemployment benefits. These were modest programs by modern standards, but they represented a fundamental shift in thinking about the state's responsibility to its citizens. The labour movement that Thomas had watched emerge in its infancy grew into a genuine political force. The Labour Party became a major party, eventually forming governments and implementing sweeping social reforms. The trade unions gained legal protections and real bargaining power. Workers could strike without being automatically fired or prosecuted. Collective bargaining became accepted, even routine. The balance of power shifted, slowly in favour of workers. The First World War disrupted everything, of course. Many bakers enlisted or were conscripted. Women entered the baking trade in large numbers to fill the labour shortage. The war economy brought government regulation of food production and distribution. Bread was rationed. Prices were controlled. The state intervened in the economy in ways that would have been unthinkable in Victorian times. And after the war, there was no going back to the old system. Too much had changed. The interwar period saw continued improvement in baking conditions, though progress was uneven and the Great Depression brought new hardships. By the time of the Second World War, the baking industry was vastly different from what Thomas had known. Large industrial bakeries dominated. Working conditions, while still demanding, were incomparably better than Victorian times. Bakers had unions, legal protections, health benefits, and something approaching fair wages. The post-war welfare state that emerged in Britain represented the culmination of reforms that had begun in the Victorian era. The National Health Service provided free healthcare. Social Security provided a real safety net. Education became universal and free. Council housing provided decent accommodation for working-class families. These developments would have seemed utopian to someone like Thomas, barely imaginable luxuries. But it's important not to romanticize the progress or imagine that everything became perfect. Even in the modern era, baking remains physically demanding work. Small independent bakeries still struggle with thin margins. Workers still face pressures to work long hours. Food safety issues still arise. The fundamental tension between profit and worker welfare hasn't disappeared. It's just been better managed through regulation and collective bargaining. And globally, conditions similar to those Thomas experienced still exist. In developing countries, bakers and other food workers often labor in conditions as bad or worse than Victorian England. Child labor persists, adulteration persists, exploitation persists. The reforms that improved conditions in Britain and other developed countries didn't automatically extend to the rest of the world. Economic development and political organization determine working conditions, and many places lack both. The story of Victorian bakers like Thomas matters because it illustrates several important historical points. First, that working conditions we now consider intolerable were once considered normal and inevitable. The idea that workers deserved safe conditions, reasonable hours, and fair wages had to be fought for against enormous resistance from employers and their political allies. Second, that reform is possible, but requires sustained effort over generations. The improvements in baking conditions didn't happen automatically or quickly. They resulted from decades of activism, investigation, legislation, and enforcement. Every gain was contested. Every reform was criticized as impractical or economically ruinous. But gradually the reformers won. Third, that economic systems create incentives that can be either humane or brutal depending on how they're structured. Victorian capitalism created incentives to exploit workers because there were no effective constraints on exploitation. Modern capitalism is somewhat more humane because regulations and unions create countervailing pressures. But the underlying dynamic, the tension between profit and worker welfare, remains. Fourth, that individual stories matter even when they're not exceptional. Thomas Whitworth was an ordinary baker who lived an ordinary working-class life. His story wasn't dramatic or heroic. He didn't lead any movements or change any laws. But his experience, multiplied by thousands of other bakers, created the reality that eventually demanded reform. Understanding that reality, understanding what daily life was actually like for working people, is essential to understanding Victorian history. The Victorian era was characterized by tremendous contradictions. It was a time of great wealth and great poverty, scientific progress and superstition, high moral rhetoric and shocking exploitation. The same society that produced Darwin and Dickens and Brunel also worked children to death in factories and mines. The same society that prided itself on civilization and progress allowed millions of its own citizens to live in squalor. These contradictions weren't lost on Victorian observers. Reformers like Charles Booth and Henry Mayhew documented working class life in excruciating detail. Socialists and trade unionists organized workers and agitated for change. Even some members of the upper classes felt guilt or concern about the conditions under which the poor lived. But knowledge and concern didn't automatically translate into action. The powerful had to be forced to share power and wealth through political struggle. The specific case of bakers illustrates these dynamics particularly well because bread was so central to Victorian life. Everyone ate bread. Everyone depended on bakers. Yet the people who performed this essential labor were treated as disposable, their health and lives sacrificed for cheap bread and business profits. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this system was remarkable. Society had to simultaneously value bread and devalue the people who made it. The adulteration issue was especially revealing of Victorian values. The fact that poisoning the food supply was considered acceptable business practice, and that weak regulations weren't enforced, showed how little the poor mattered to the powerful. The wealthy could afford pure bread from quality bakeries. The poor got whatever they could afford, which was often toxic. This was considered natural and inevitable, just how markets worked. The public health implications of Victorian baking conditions extended beyond the bakers themselves. Adulterated bread contributed to malnutrition and various health problems among consumers, especially children. The unsanitary conditions in bakehouses meant that bread was often contaminated with bacteria. Though this wasn't understood given the primitive state of microbiology, rats and insects in flour storage contributed to disease transmission. The whole system was a public health disaster that particularly harmed the most vulnerable. Infant mortality in Victorian England was shockingly high, especially among the working class. Many factors contributed, including poor sanitation, crowded housing, lack of medical care, and maternal malnutrition. But diet was crucial, and diet for working class families was dominated by bread. When that bread was adulterated and nutritionally poor, children suffered. The long-term effects of childhood malnutrition included stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and reduced life expectancy. The gender dimensions of Victorian baking are worth exploring. Most bakers were men, though women worked in retail shops selling bread, and sometimes in certain aspects of production. Baking was considered too physically demanding for women. Though this was partly ideology and partly reality, given that the work was genuinely brutal. Women in baking families bore the burden of managing households on inadequate wages, caring for sick workers, and raising children in poverty. Margaret Whitworth's life was in some ways harder than Thomas's, though differently so. She didn't work 18-hour shifts in a bakehouse, but she managed a household on poverty wages, which required constant strategizing about how to stretch pennies, what to buy, when to pay which bills, how to keep the family fed and housed. This cognitive and emotional labor was exhausting in its own way, and she did it while bearing and raising children, nursing sick family members, and dealing with the constant stress of potential eviction or destitution. The emotional toll of Victorian working class life is difficult to quantify, but shouldn't be underestimated. The constant stress, the lack of security, the knowledge that one illness or accident could destroy the family, the inability to plan for the future or pursue dreams, all of this created psychological burdens. Depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues were common, but rarely diagnosed or treated. People just endured, because what else could they do? Thomas likely suffered from chronic depression, though he wouldn't have had vocabulary for it or access to treatment. The exhaustion, the sense of hopelessness, the feeling that life was just one endless cycle of work and sleep and work again, these are symptoms of depression. But in Victorian England, these were just considered normal responses to normal life. The idea that working class people deserved mental health care would have seemed absurd to most observers. The role of alcohol in working class Victorian life was complex. Heavy drinking was common and socially accepted among men. The pub was the social centre, the place where men could relax and socialise. But alcoholism was also a major problem, contributing to domestic violence, family poverty, and health issues. The temperance movement focused on individual moral failings, rather than the social conditions that made drinking so appealing. If your life is miserable and you have no other escapes, alcohol makes sense as a coping mechanism, however unhealthy. Thomas's relationship with his children was shaped by his work schedule and exhaustion. He barely saw them. When he did, he was too tired to be fully present. This wasn't because he didn't love them or care about them, but because the structure of his working life made meaningful family relationships nearly impossible. Victorian working class fathers were often distant figures, providers rather than nurturers, and this wasn't entirely by choice. The system separated families by making impossible demands on workers' time. The education Thomas's children received was minimal by modern standards, but represented progress compared to earlier generations when working-class children received no formal education at all. The gradual expansion of elementary education in the late Victorian period was crucial to social mobility and eventual political empowerment of the working class. Literacy enabled workers to read newspapers, understand political arguments, and organize effectively. Education was genuinely threatening to the established order, which is why it was resisted for so long. The living conditions in Victorian working class housing were appalling by modern standards. Overcrowding was extreme, with entire families living in 1 or 2 rooms. Sanitation was primitive, with shared outdoor toilets and no running water in many buildings. Diseases spread rapidly in these conditions. Privacy was non-existent. The physical and psychological effects of living in such cramped, unhealthy spaces were profound. The rookeries of Victorian London, the worst slums, were even more horrific than the tenements where Thomas lived. These were areas where buildings were so old and poorly maintained they were literally falling apart, where crime was rampant, where sanitation was non-existent, where multiple families shared single rooms. Reformers documented these conditions in shocked tones, but improvement was slow because the poor had no political power and property owners had no incentive to improve conditions. The cholera epidemics that periodically swept through Victorian London disproportionately affected the poor. Cholera spread through contaminated water, and working-class neighbourhoods had the worst water supplies. The epidemics killed thousands and finally forced authorities to invest in proper sewerage and clean water supplies. But even this public health triumph was motivated partly by fear that disease might spread to wealthy neighbourhoods, not primarily by concern for the poor themselves. The relationship between the Victorian working class and the police was often antagonistic. Police were seen as enforcers of the ruling class's interests, protecting property rather than people. Working class neighbourhoods were simultaneously policed for crimes like petty theft or public drunkenness, and policed for crimes like domestic violence or employer exploitation. The legal system was seen as biased against the poor, which it absolutely was. Thomas had limited interactions with police, mostly seeing them on the streets maintaining order. He'd never been arrested, though he'd been warned a few times for various minor infractions. The police presence in Victorian London was partly about crime prevention, but also about social control, making sure the working class didn't get too unruly or too organised. Strikes were often broken up by police. Political meetings were monitored. The state used law enforcement to maintain the class system. The Victorian workhouse system deserves special attention as perhaps the cruelest aspect of Victorian social policy. The workhouses were deliberately made miserable to deter people from seeking help, based on the theory that poverty was a moral failing and that making relief unpleasant would encourage people to work harder. This ignored the reality that most poor people were already working as hard as humanly possible, and that poverty resulted from low wages and unemployment, not laziness. Families were separated in workhouses, husbands from wives, parents from children. Inmates wore uniforms, followed strict schedules, and performed mind-numbing labour like picking oakum or breaking stones. The food was minimal and terrible. The conditions were deliberately prison-like. And all of this was justified on moral grounds, as if crushing the spirits of desperate people was somehow virtuous. Thomas's terror of the workhouse was entirely rational. It represented the complete loss of autonomy, dignity, and family. It was where you went when you'd completely failed, when there were no other options. The fact that Victorian society created conditions that made workhouse admission common, then punished the victims of those conditions, was a moral atrocity that reformers increasingly recognized as such. The gradual reform of the poor law, and eventual replacement of the workhouse system with more humane forms of social assistance, represented major progress. By the early 20th century, outdoor relief became more common, meaning people could receive help without entering the workhouse. Pensions and insurance schemes provided alternatives. The principle that society had an obligation to help its most vulnerable members, without punishing them for their vulnerability, slowly gained acceptance. The role of religion in Victorian working class life was complicated. The established churches often supported the social order and told the poor to accept their lot and expect rewards in the afterlife. But nonconformist churches and some progressive clergy actually supported working class causes and provided practical assistance. The social gospel movement argued that Christianity required addressing social injustice, not just saving individual souls. Thomas's skepticism about religion was common among working class men who'd been told that God ordained the social hierarchy, and that suffering was good for the soul. It was hard to accept that a benevolent God would design a system where children died from preventable diseases and workers were destroyed by their labor. The problem of evil, always a theological challenge, was especially acute when your life was mostly suffering. But Margaret's faith was also understandable and typical. Religion provided community, ritual, meaning, and hope. It suggested that suffering wasn't meaningless, that there was a larger plan, that justice would eventually be done, even if not in this life. For people with little power to change their circumstances, this kind of hope was valuable, even necessary. The critique that religion was the opiate of the masses had some truth, but opiates serve a purpose when you're in pain. The Victorian obsession with respectability affected working class life in complex ways. There was a strong cultural pressure to maintain appearances, to keep your home clean, even if it was tiny, to dress as well as possible, even if clothes were patched and worn, to behave properly even if you were exhausted and desperate. This respectability culture served partly to maintain discipline and partly to allow working class people some dignity in difficult circumstances. Thomas and Margaret tried to be respectable, tried to maintain standards, tried to give their children some sense of propriety. This wasn't just internalized oppression, though that was part of it. It was also an assertion of humanity, a refusal to be completely degraded by poverty. The insistence on respectability said we may be poor, but we're still people, still worthy of respect, still maintaining civilization even in terrible conditions. The distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor was central to Victorian social policy. The deserving poor were those who worked hard, maintained respectable behavior, and experienced poverty through no fault of their own. The undeserving poor were those deemed lazy, immoral, irresponsible. This distinction was largely fictional and served mainly to justify providing minimal help even to the deserving, while withholding all help from the undeserving. Thomas would have been considered deserving, a hard-working man providing for his family. But the distinction was pernicious, because it implied that poverty was usually deserved, that most poor people were poor, because of personal failings. This ideology justified the brutality of the system by blaming victims. The reality was that wages were too low, hours too long, conditions too dangerous, and opportunities too limited. Poverty was structural, not individual. The Victorian period saw enormous technological and scientific progress, from railways and telegraphs to Darwin's theory of evolution and advances in medicine. But these advances were unevenly distributed. The wealthy benefited immediately from new technologies and medical care. The working class benefited eventually, sometimes generations later, if at all. Thomas lived in an age of progress, but barely experienced any of that progress directly. The Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851 showcased British industrial and technological achievements to the world. Thomas would have heard about it, but couldn't have afforded to visit. Even if he could have afforded the admission, he couldn't have taken time off work. The exhibition celebrated progress that working people had created through their labor, but from which they were largely excluded. This was emblematic of Victorian society. Workers built everything but enjoyed almost nothing. The literature of the Victorian period increasingly addressed social conditions. Dickens's novels depicted working class life, though often through a middle-class lens. Elizabeth Gaskell wrote about industrial workers. George Gissing wrote about urban poverty. These works helped shape public consciousness and contributed to reform movements. But there's always a question about whether working class people could recognize themselves in middle class representations of their lives. Thomas, on the rare occasions when he read fiction, appreciated seeing people like himself depicted, but also noticed the differences between literary representations and reality. Dickens's poor people often maintained cheerfulness and morality despite their circumstances, which was sometimes true, but ignored the way poverty ground people down, made them bitter, destroyed their capacity for joy. The reality was grimmer than most literature acknowledged. The Victorian emphasis on self, help and individual responsibility was another ideological tool for justifying inequality. Samuel Smiles's book, Self-Help, was hugely influential, arguing that anyone could succeed through hard work and moral virtue. This ignored the structural barriers that made success nearly impossible for working class people regardless of how hard they worked. Thomas worked incredibly hard his entire life and never escaped poverty. The problem wasn't his work ethic. The problem was the system. But self-help ideology was appealing because it suggested agency and possibility. If success was just about working hard and making good choices, then there was hope. The alternative, accepting that the system was rigged and that individual effort was largely futile, was too depressing to bear, so people clung to self-help ideas even when their own experience contradicted them. The friendly societies and mutual aid organizations that existed in Victorian working class communities were important social institutions. These were member-funded organizations that provided insurance against sickness, unemployment, and death. They were limited by the poverty of their members, but represented working class self-organization and solidarity. Thomas belonged to such a society for many years, though he eventually couldn't afford the dues. These mutual aid organizations were precursors to the welfare state, demonstrating that working people could organize for their collective benefit. They also demonstrated the limits of self-help. When an entire community was poor, mutual insurance could only do so much. Eventually, broader social support funded by taxation became necessary. The emigration of so many working-class Britons to the colonies and America in the Victorian period represented both opportunity and tragedy. Opportunity because conditions were often better elsewhere, at least for skilled workers. Tragedy because emigration meant leaving family, home, everything familiar, often forever. Thomas had cousins who emigrated to Canada and Australia. He never saw them again. Never knew whether they succeeded or failed. The drain of working-class emigrants, often the youngest and most energetic, was a kind of pressure valve for Victorian society. It removed potential sources of unrest and gave ambitious workers an alternative to political organising. But it also represented a failure of British society to provide decent opportunities for its own people. Why should a skilled baker have to leave England to find decent working conditions? The Victorian period's attitude toward children was paradoxical. There was increasing sentimentality about childhood innocence and the importance of nurturing children. But working-class children were routinely worked in mines, factories, and workshops, their childhood sacrificed to family economic survival. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable. Children were precious and deserved protection, unless they were poor, in which case they needed to work. Child labour reform was one of the great achievements of Victorian social reform. The gradual restriction and eventual prohibition of child labour in most industries was crucial. But enforcement was always a challenge, and families desperate for income found ways to put children to work. Thomas's children had worked, doing small jobs for pennies, because the family needed every bit of income. This was normal and expected. The Victorian period saw the emergence of childhood as a distinct life stage, at least for the middle class. Working-class children had always moved quickly from infancy to productive labour, but as education became more universal and child labour more restricted, even working-class children got some years of childhood. This represented genuine progress, though it happened very gradually. Thomas's grandchildren, born in the 1890s and early 1900s, would have childhoods somewhat more resembling the modern concept. They'd attend school, at least for a few years. They wouldn't start full-time work until their early teens. They'd have some time for play and development. This was a major achievement, one of the most significant improvements in working class life. The public health movement of the late Victorian period transformed urban life. The construction of sewerage systems, provision of clean water, collection of garbage, inspection of food, these unglamorous measures saved countless lives. The statistics are striking. Infant mortality declined, life expectancy increased. Infectious diseases became less common. These improvements were particularly beneficial to the working class, who'd been most affected by poor sanitation. But public health reform faced enormous opposition from property owners who didn't want to pay for improvements, and from ideologues who opposed government intervention in private matters. The fact that improvements eventually happened represented the success of reform movements and the growing recognition that public health was a collective concern, not just an individual responsibility. The Victorian period also saw increasing recognition of occupational health and safety as legitimate concerns. The documentation of occupational diseases, the investigation of industrial accidents, the gradual implementation of safety standards, these were important developments. They saved lives and reduced suffering, though the pace of reform was frustratingly slow and incomplete. Thomas baker's asthma was eventually recognized as an occupational disease caused by flour dust exposure. This recognition didn't help Thomas, but it helped later generations of bakers who benefited from better ventilation, dust control, and health monitoring. The principle that workers shouldn't be expected to sacrifice their health for employment became gradually accepted. Though translating principle into practice took decades, the Victorian period ended officially in 1901 with Queen Victoria's death, but the social and economic system that characterized the era continued for years afterward. World War I marked a more decisive break, as the demands of total war required unprecedented government intervention in the economy and society. The war accelerated social changes that had been gradually developing, including women's suffrage, labor rights, and social welfare programs. If Thomas had lived to see 1914 and the outbreak of war, he would have been in his 80s, ancient by working class standards. He would have seen enormous changes in his lifetime: the expansion of voting rights, the growth of labor unions, significant improvements in working conditions and public health. But he also would have known that progress was incomplete, that many battles remained to be fought, that the basic structure of class inequality persisted. The lesson of Thomas's life, and the lives of countless Victorian workers like him, is that social progress requires sustained political struggle. The improvements that occurred didn't happen automatically or inevitably. They happened because reformers investigated conditions, publicized abuses, organized workers, formed political parties, passed legislation, and enforced standards. Every gain was contested and had to be defended. Today, when we buy bread at a supermarket or bakery, we rarely think about the people who made it or the conditions under which they work. Baking has been largely automated and industrialized. Working conditions are regulated and generally safe by historical standards. But exploitation hasn't disappeared. It's shifted to other industries and other countries. The dynamics that created Victorian bakehouse conditions still exist wherever regulation is weak and workers lack power. Understanding Victorian working class life isn't just historical interest. It's relevant to contemporary debates about labor rights, regulation, and economic inequality. The arguments used to oppose Victorian reforms are structurally similar to arguments used today against minimum wages, safety standards, and labor protections. Business will be hurt. Costs will be passed to consumers. Foreign competition will drive domestic producers out of business. Workers will lose jobs. These arguments were wrong then, and they're wrong now. The Victorian period also demonstrates that terrible conditions can be normalized, can come to seem natural and inevitable. People living within the system often can't imagine alternatives. Thomas couldn't really imagine a world where bakers worked 8-hour shifts in well-ventilated facilities for decent wages. Such a world seemed utopian and possibly idealistic. But that world eventually came into being through collective effort. The role of documentation and publicity in driving reform is worth emphasizing. The investigations by journalists, social reformers, and government inspectors that exposed Victorian working conditions were crucial to building public support for change. People are often willing to tolerate injustice they don't see or know about. Making injustice visible creates pressure for reform. This is why contemporary labour activists emphasise documentation and publicity. The Victorian baker's story also illustrates the limits of individual agency under structural constraints. Thomas couldn't escape his circumstances through hard work or moral virtue, though he possessed both. The system was designed to extract maximum labour for minimum compensation, and individual workers had no leverage to change that. Only collective action and political intervention could alter the fundamental dynamics. But individual stories matter because they humanize statistics and abstract concepts. Saying that bakers worked 18-hour shifts in unhealthy conditions is one thing. Following Thomas through a night in the bakehouse, seeing his exhaustion and pain and resignation, understanding his relationships and hopes and fears, that's something else. History is made by real people, not abstractions, and understanding those people's experiences is essential to understanding the past. Thomas Whitworth never knew that his life might someday be reconstructed as an example of Victorian working conditions. He certainly never imagined that anyone would care about his story. He was just trying to survive, to provide for his family, to maintain some dignity in circumstances that constantly eroded dignity. But his life mattered, his suffering mattered, his labour mattered, and the slow, painful progress toward better conditions that occurred after his death vindicated the reformers who insisted that workers deserved better. The Victorian period was when modern industrial capitalism fully emerged, and many of its contradictions became apparent. The tremendous productive capacity that could generate wealth also ground up workers. The free market that enabled innovation also enabled exploitation. The limited government that protected property rights ignored workers' rights. These tensions had to be resolved through political struggle, and that struggle continues today in different forms. Looking back at Victorian bakers from our current perspective, it's easy to feel both horror at their conditions and satisfaction at the progress we've made. But complacency is dangerous. The protections workers enjoy today were hard-won and can be eroded. The regulatory frameworks that ensure safe working conditions require vigilance and enforcement. The balance of power between capital and labour constantly shifts and must be actively maintained. The story of Victorian baking is ultimately a story about human resilience and the capacity for social change. Thomas and his fellow bakers endured conditions that would break most people. They maintained their humanity despite systematic dehumanization. They created families and communities despite poverty and exhaustion, and their suffering, documented and publicized, became part of the case for reform that eventually improved conditions for future workers. If there's a moral to this story, it's that terrible conditions are neither natural nor inevitable. They result from choices, from economic systems and political arrangements that can be changed. Change is difficult, requiring sustained effort over generations. But it's possible. The Victorian bakers who suffered in underground hellholes helped create the foundation for reforms that made baking a more human profession. Their lives, however difficult, weren't meaningless. They mattered, and we should remember them.